Story 1: The War of the Triple Alliance. Paraguay engaged in conflict with Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, resulting in the death of an estimated 90% of its male population. Story 2: Sacking a trade caravan sent by Genghis Khan, and then killing the diplomats Genghis Khan sent to discuss the sacking of the trade caravan, resulted in the death and enslavement of millions, the sacking of many major cities, and the emperor being hunted into the sea less than 2 years later. This nearly wiped out the Muslim religion, causing a huge loss of faith due to the terrible events they experienced. Story 3: In the late 500s and early 600s, the Sui dynasty of China invaded Goguryeo, one of the early Korean kingdoms, under the pretext that conquering Goguryeo was necessary to unify China. The entire Sui army camped around the Salsu River. The Goguryeo general destroyed the dam upstream of the Sui camp, washing away and killing hundreds of thousands of sleeping Chinese soldiers during the night. Most soldiers who survived the flood were caught on the wrong side of the river, where Goguryeo troops mercilessly cut them down. The Chinese army sent to invade Goguryeo numbered 305,000 men, but of this force, only 2,700 survived. This massive loss destabilized China, leading to the collapse of the Sui dynasty not long after. This battle is considered one of the deadliest in pre-industrial history. Story 4: One of the most lopsided naval battles in history happened when Napoleon's navy chained all their ships together near some shoals in North Africa, with only the cannons on the side facing out to sea prepared for battle, since they expected any British naval engagement to happen on the seaward side. But when the British finally arrived, Horatio Nelson sailed half his ships into the narrow area on the side closer to shore. The French underestimated how deep the water was on that side and were blasted from both sides, whereas the French were only prepared to fight back on one side. The French flagship caught fire, and its massive gunpowder magazine, containing around 40 tons of gunpowder, exploded in one of the largest explosions of its era. It was such a lopsided victory that it effectively neutralized French naval power in the Mediterranean for the rest of the war. The British suffered roughly 250 casualties, while the French lost 1,700 and had about 3,000 captured. Several French ships that were not destroyed were captured and added to the strength of the British fleet. The French were not entirely wrong about the risk of shallow water on the beach side. During the battle, several ships ran aground. However, assuming Nelson would not send ships into the gap was a fatal miscalculation. The destruction of this fleet left Napoleon and his army stranded in Egypt. The sinking of his flagship also sank the coins and treasure he was counting on to finance his military campaign in Egypt. Napoleon eventually returned, but he abandoned his troops in Egypt. Story 5: There is a podcast about the Russo-Japanese War called Lions Led by Donkeys. There are many podcasts on this topic, but that one is highly recommended. Story 6: The naval battles around Guadalcanal involved many questionable decisions on both sides. When one side has radar but has never fought at night, and the other side does not have radar but is experienced in night engagements, the results can be unpredictable. Story 7: South Vietnam retreating from the Central Highlands in the 1975 campaign is a very good contender. The causal mechanisms leading to and resulting from it were clearly documented, culminating in the regime's collapse. Story 8: I have not seen Pickett's charge mentioned, but General Robert E. Lee committing several divisions to a full frontal assault up a hill against an improved defensive position was complete madness. It literally cost the South any chance they had of defeating the United States Army. Story 9: Pyrrhus of Epirus led a campaign against ancient Rome in the Pyrrhic War, which gave its name to the phrase Pyrrhic victory. Similarly, Alexander the Great's invasion of India yielded no significant gains and nearly undermined all his previous accomplishments. Story 10: The most disastrous mistake was not technically military when it happened, but it led to the destruction of the Khwarezm Empire. During the reign of Genghis Khan, the Mongols sent a goodwill delegation to establish trade relationships with Khwarezm, located in modern Iran and the surrounding areas. This was after the Mongols conquered China, and they were not looking for war but to trade at this time. The Shah of Khwarezm surrounded himself with people who flattered him, and he had the delusional notion that he was the new Alexander, as did his officials. His uncle, who received the Mongol delegation, killed the Mongols and stole their goods. News of this reached Genghis Khan, who was outraged. He sent another delegation demanding that the person responsible be punished. As if the original mistake was not bad enough, the Shah, flattered into thinking he was invincible, humiliated the Mongols, sent them back, and reportedly killed a few more. At that point, Genghis Khan launched a massive campaign against Khwarezm, laying siege to all their cities. Previously, the Mongols were not skilled at siege warfare, but after the conquest of China, they integrated Chinese siege engineers into their military and became adept at destroying fortified walled cities, which their horse archers were mostly ineffective against. Grand and beautiful ancient Persian cities were reduced to ash, and the entire empire was wiped out. Most people lived in walled cities, and the majority of those were annihilated. Provoking the Mongols with such outrageous insult and treachery resulted in the empire being genocide, with their cities reduced to ash and heaps of bones. The Shah's uncle was captured and punished for his greed and insolence by having molten silver poured down his throat. The Shah himself fled into exile and may have committed suicide. The most famous quote from this event came when Genghis Khan rounded up all the people in a city he was about to destroy, possibly the capital, into their grand mosque and berated them from the pulpit, saying, "I am the flail of God. If you had not committed terrible sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Story 11. Operation Barbarossa. Napoleon could not do it, and neither could Adolf Hitler. It was a total and absolute disaster. Tens of millions of lives were lost in the bonfire of total war. I am American, and it has always been about D-Day, but it is the Battle of Stalingrad that is the turning point of the Second World War. I have been reading about some of Adolf Hitler's collaborators in the Balkans, and they were obsessed with Operation Barbarossa. They knew the entire fate of the war depended on it. D-Day was significant, of course. It opened another front for Adolf Hitler and kept troops bottled up that might have been sent east to fight the invading Red Army. The war was decided at the Battle of Stalingrad. D-Day probably prevented Joseph Stalin from moving towards the Atlantic. Story 12. Read on the psychology of military incompetence. Many fine examples that would be hilarious if they were not so tragic. Story 13. Starting a land war in Asia that lasts into the winter. Napoleon was the pioneer, and Adolf Hitler was the copycat. Story 14. Japan attacking the United States during World War II. There was a sizable bloc of Americans who had no problem with the Axis powers. The attack on Pearl Harbor is what made the United States' direct involvement in the war politically tenable. Story 15. In terms of financial cost and benefit, does anything exceed the United States war in Afghanistan? Imagine what $2.3 trillion or $46 billion per state invested in the United States could do. Instead, we spent $2.3 trillion, lost American, Afghani, and coalition lives, and handed the country with improved infrastructure over to our rivals as a trade partner. Story 16. I do not know about all of history, but I would say not being careful enough about who parks box trucks next to your Air Force bases is the biggest issue I can think of in the last 10 years or so. Story 17. European observation of the American Civil War. European observers came to watch battles in the Civil War and were disgusted by the lack of discipline and cowardly behavior. Many of the observers were European aristocrats who still believed that armies should behave like chess pieces and move in lines and columns. They completely misunderstood that the advent of accurate rifles firing mini-balls, repeating arms like revolvers, Gatling guns, and lever-action rifles unleashed withering fire where standing in formation was suicide. Not learning this lesson led directly to the carnage of World War I and the stalemate of trench warfare. Story 18. October 7th is definitely significant. I do not know exactly what Hamas expected to happen, but almost everyone involved in planning and carrying out the attack is dead. Gaza is in ruins, its population severely reduced, and there is a very real possibility that they will cease to exist as a demographic before it is over, since no one seems to care enough to make Israel stop, and they cannot or will not stop themselves. This is on the level of murdering Genghis Khan's envoys. Story 19. Manzikert. If Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes had ignored the Turks who were asking for a truce and let them focus on Egypt instead, then Constantinople may have never fallen. This event permanently weakened the power and influence of the Eastern Roman Empire also known as the Byzantine Empire, in Anatolia and changed the course of history. Story 20. Gallipoli was an exercise in pure stupidity and a massive loss of lives that should never have happened if someone with even half a brain cell had been in charge of planning it. Story 21. Perhaps the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome. I am not sure there was any way to avoid the First War, but the Barcid clan pushed Carthage into the second, and Rome was looking for a chance to have a third. In any event, the wars ended with the complete destruction of Carthage. These were not on the scale of world wars, but a lot of knowledge, history, and other valuable information was lost in the sack of Carthage. Story 22. The Battle of Saratoga during the American Revolution. Washington's army walked into a trap set by the British that could have defeated the colonials. Fortunately, General Benedict Arnold refused to join the battle because he did not want General Horatio Gates to receive all the glory, so he held back. Without General Arnold's army, Washington defeated General Gates' forces in a decisive victory that could have easily been a total defeat. Story 23. Ukraine is performing well. Losing 1/3 of your strategic bombers to a small country is not a good situation. Story 24. In late Roman history, there was a couple who played major roles in bringing down the Western Roman Empire. The Battle of Adrianople was a disaster for Rome. Seeking to take advantage of the desperate Goths who were fleeing the Huns, the emperor granted them safe passage and settlement within the borders of the empire. The Romans in charge of the resettlement treated them terribly, forcing many to sell their children into slavery for scraps of food. The Goths eventually rebelled when the Romans assassinated most of the Gothic leadership and ransacked the area south of the Danube for food, their missing children, and for revenge. This uprising resulted in the Battle of Adrianople and ended as a major Gothic victory, with a Roman field army defeated and the emperor himself dead. Story 25. Gallipoli was an absolute comedy of errors. There are worse losses for sure, but Gallipoli involved so many poor decisions by so many people that it is the first thing that comes to mind. Story 26. During the early days of Alexander the Great's campaigns against Persia, a Greek commander on the Persian side advised not to engage Alexander because he had invested everything into the invasion. Without a battle to gain loot from, he would be quickly forced to leave as he would go bankrupt. They did not listen. Story 27. The Maginot Line itself was effective. However, the judgment that German tanks could not drive through the Ardennes was the third biggest mistake by a Western military in the past 100 years. The second biggest mistake was Chamberlain's appeasement policy. The biggest mistake was Stalin believing the entire Soviet military could conquer Finland. Story 28. There are many, but a personal one from my husband is Operation Market Garden. He lost his grandfather there. Story 29. Battle of Hattin. The Templars broke a truce based on a rumor and were in the midst of a siege after losing about 45% of their entire army. Everyone told the emperor, maybe let them go home. But the emperor refused, saying, no, that is not strong leadership. As a result, the rest of the army became trapped in a desert and continued to be besieged by the same forces. The besiegers even showed caravans of camels carrying water to the Templars. Story 30. Probably something like failing to destroy the British army at Dunkirk. Adolf Hitler liked to sleep in. His army waited for orders, and the United Kingdom lived to fight another day. Story 31. While the history of this event is yet to be written, Vladimir Putin's special military operation to invade Ukraine appears to be one of the most ill-advised military decisions in world history. Story 32. Invading Iraq destabilized the entire region and created a power vacuum that Iran filled, leading to the acceleration of their nuclear weapons program. It diverted resources from Afghanistan, contributing to the failure of other regimes as well as the return of the Taliban. Story 33. Trying to walk into Russia in the dead of winter. Nobody invades Russia in winter and comes out successful. Story 34. Battle of Pharsalus. Strategically unnecessary for Pompey, who should have just starved Julius Caesar. Tactically, his haphazard retreat doomed him. Julius Caesar won through Pompey's mistakes and thus changed Western history. Story 35. Germany invading Russia. That is where the bulk of the fighting in World War II happened, and it was a bloodbath. Had Adolf Hitler not invaded Russia, the United States would be facing the full force of Nazi Germany. Story 36. The Battle of Manzikert was fought between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Seljuk Turco-Persian Sultanate. The Eastern Romans nearly won, forcing the Seljuks to retreat and sacking their camp. However, one of the generals, from a rival family of Emperor Romanos Diogenes, deserted the battlefield with the rearguard. This allowed the Turks to regroup, capture Romanos, and win the battle. Romanos was treated well in Sultan Alp Arslan's captivity and was later released. However, his rivals seized the opportunity to usurp the throne, causing a series of civil wars that devastated Anatolia, which includes modern-day Turkey and half of the Eastern Roman Empire's territory. This devastation allowed another wave of Turks to take over the region. The Battle of Manzikert also triggered the Crusades, which eventually led to the Fourth Crusade, during which much of the Eastern Roman Empire was occupied or sacked by the Franks. This chain of events contributed to the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which ultimately ended the Eastern Roman Empire. Story 37. Pearl Harbor united a nation that was previously unenthusiastic about the war. It immediately brought everyone together and set the war effort in motion. Japan was changed forever. Story 38. Probably that general's decision not to send American troops into the Battle of Tora Bora and leave it up to the Afghans instead. If it were not for that, Osama bin Laden would have been killed or captured as early as 2001, and the whole war would have ended sooner. Actions like that genuinely make me suspect that George Bush had a role to play in September 11th attacks. I certainly would not put it past him. Story 39. The Battle of Tsushima was a complete failure for Russia, resulting in the loss of most of its fleet in a single battle. It established Japan as a rising world power and significantly damaged Russia's prestige. Story 40. Pearl Harbor and the decisions by Japan and Germany. First, the Japanese High Command, excluding Yamamoto, clearly underestimated America's determined will to win a total war after Pearl Harbor. With the benefit of hindsight, we often assume the war had to happen and that America was destined to win it. Neither is true. Contemporary records show the sudden shift in America's attitude toward fighting Japan. Before that point, humanitarian militarism was largely directed at Germany. The oil and steel sanctions against Japan were about as far as America was willing to go on behalf of China. The most significant reaction was Hitler's response to Pearl Harbor. He immediately declared war on the United States of America and believed this reckless act would benefit Germany. Japan gained strategic advantage to seize oil in Southeast Asia. However, no German operation benefited from war with America, not even the submarine campaign against Britain. The pact with Japan did not obligate Hitler to declare war. The war with Russia had already severely strained Germany, and opening this third front was a reckless gamble. But fascists are often reckless. Story 41. The Iraq War was based on a bold-faced lie about weapons of mass destruction. The attacks on September 11th altered the course of United States priorities significantly in a negative way, mostly because of how badly we mishandled our response to them. Story 42. Germany bombed London instead of bombing Royal Air Force airfields in World War II. This gave the pilots a respite, saved the island from invasion, and the rest is history. Story 43. A combination of Russia's military actions under Tsar Nicholas II led to the revolution that created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The death toll from 1918 onward related to this event is staggering. Story 44. In modern times, I think it will be the United States' withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a geopolitical mistake that will have ramifications for the next century. Story 45. Operation Barbarossa. If Adolf Hitler had not opened a two-front war, he might have been able to hold onto Western Europe. Story 46. The Germans split their resources to fight the Second World War on two fronts, European and Russian. They could have conquered Europe otherwise. Disastrous for them, but a great outcome for the Allies. Story 47. Paraguay tried to take on Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina by itself, and ended up losing about 70% of its population. Story 48. Manzikert 1071. A Roman Byzantine emperor had not been taken prisoner in over 800 years. Anatolia was overrun by the Turks, and although the Byzantine Empire continued for almost 4 more centuries, it was merely a shadow of its former self. Story 49. Hitler's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941 triggered the Eastern Front, which was the main cause of Nazi Germany's defeat. It is also the largest invasion and military operation in world history. Story 50. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese lost millions of tons of neutral shipping, brought the United States into the war, and nearly killed their entire male population aged 17 to 30. Including the European theater, which might have stalemated at some point. That one event destroyed multiple nations. Story 51. The September 11th attacks triggered an immediate invasion of Afghanistan and provided a reason to invade Iraq. Perpetrators who survived were largely either imprisoned or spent their last years in hiding. Story 52. World War II. Hitler deciding to attack the Soviets, thus opening up an eastern battlefront in addition to the existing Western Front. Absolute lunacy. Story 53. The Vijayanagar Empire's mistake was trusting its Muslim generals. Germany's mistake was holding Stalingrad in World War II. Story 54. Nagumo, Imperial Japanese Navy, 1942 at Midway, deciding to switch from bombs to torpedoes on his carrier strike force when he realized that American carriers were nearby. Hitler and Goering, Luftwaffe, 1940 Battle of Britain, changing targets to strike London instead of Royal Air Force airfields and radar stations after Royal Air Force Bomber Command mounted a nuisance raid on Berlin. Story 55. The Austrian painter invaded Russia with insufficient logistics and ignored the requests of his generals to let them set up winter camps and wait for spring. He was obsessed with the idea that the Soviets were close to collapse, despite the fact that they were receiving large amounts of resupply via the Arctic convoys and Americans. The Russians did not surrender even after Napoleon captured Moscow. Story 56. Missing the oil deposits at Pearl Harbor. From memory, it was about 100 million liters or a 9-month supply. It would have crippled the Pacific Fleet to a far greater extent than what actually happened. Story 57. The United States Army decided not to send in a battalion of troops when Osama bin Laden was cornered at Tora Bora. This led to a 20-year, $3 trillion war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and the displacement of millions. Story 58. On a total number of people killed versus goals actually accomplished basis, it has to be Operation Barbarossa. There are wars where more people died, but the goals of Operation Barbarossa versus the actual results must be one of the most significant military failures in history. They went from, "We will occupy the steppe" to the Astrakhan to Arkhangelsk line, to, "Oh no, the Soviets are inside the Reich Chancellery in Berlin," in less than 4 years. Story 59. As of January 2025, I believe the worst military mistake in history was Canada choosing to become a non-nuclear power. Story 60. I hope one day in the year 2200 someone asks this question, and among the top comments is the Russian invasion of Ukraine from 2022 onwards. For almost a century, Russia's military was considered at least the second most capable and powerful force. Now they are a joke. The long-term costs of the subsequent domestic crackdowns on dissent, press, and opposition politics. The loss of 1 million men in a country facing a demographic crisis, brain drain, reduced access to foreign investment and capital are staggering. Story 61. Battle of the Somme. The idea that walking in formation would protect infantry from machine gun fire. Story 62. The most disastrous military mistake was committed by the Khwarezmian Empire. You have not heard of them? Exactly. Story 63. Not a military mistake per se, but the failure to properly implement Reconstruction after the American Civil War is costing us to this day. Story 64. People point out the folly of declaring war and invading Russia. However, this is a smaller mistake than declaring war on the United States of America without any means whatsoever to attack the continental United States of America. How are you going to win if you cannot even attack? Story 65. Not crushing the United States South after their defeat. Scorched earth is what the traitors deserved. What they got was too kind. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.